Imagine if the language you speak today were to disappear. If there were nobody left to pass on the words to younger generations. If the words that hold within them your culture no longer existed. For many languages, this is the case. Russ Reimer of the National Geographic wrote, "One language dies every 14 days. By the next century, nearly half of the roughly 7,000 languages spoken on Earth will likely disappear. Among the victims of these disappearances are the 60 Aboriginal dialects spoken in Canada." According to the University of Ottawa, while some of these languages have flourished, others are on the verge of extinction. For example, there are only 8 people who speak Tuscarora. With this decrease in the number of speakers of these languages, the distinct Aboriginal cultures are at risk too, as all of them are directly intertwined with their language. The Federal Task Force on Aboriginal Languages and Cultures, also known as the Task Force, said, "Language and culture are the foundations of the nationhood of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Should these languages cease to exist, it is not just a language that is lost, but a culture deeply engraved on the pages of Canadian history." Which leads us to the question, to what extent does Canadian society have a responsibility to preserve them? Today, we will be evaluating the linguistic, historical, and educational lenses regarding this issue in order to understand both what is lost when Canada loses a language and what Canadian society must do to prevent this. In order to understand the importance of preserving Aboriginal languages, it is first important to understand the importance of the languages themselves. Aboriginal languages and cultures go hand in hand. The task force said, "Language, culture, and spiritual values, and First Nation, Inuit, and Métis sense of identity are inseparable concepts. Should an Aboriginal dialect vanish, Canada would lose an understanding of its people." According to Paulina Johnson, a researcher of Indigenous languages from the University of Western Ontario, the majority of the beliefs that distinguish Aboriginal cultures in Canada are passed on through oral traditions like songs. Although these traditions distinguish the different cultures, they also put them more at risk. Statistics Canada says that only 15% of Aboriginals reported speaking an Aboriginal language at home, and the majority of speakers are 55 years or older. With this aging population, the languages are at a higher risk of vanishing, and so is their knowledge. Russ Reimer stated, "When small communities abandon their languages and switch to English, there's a massive disruption in the transfer of traditional knowledge across generations." Should an Aboriginal language disappear, their knowledge would also disappear and would no longer be available to Canadians. Regarding the historical lens, Aboriginal languages have been extremely disadvantaged. When the Europeans settled in Canada, they forcefully took and settled on the land of Aboriginals. Researchers from the Centre for Research on Globalization said, "The main goal of settler colonialism in Canada was to displace Indigenous people and bury their cultures, ultimately eliminating Indigenous societies so that settlers could establish themselves. From this point onwards, Aboriginals began to learn Western languages so that they could trade with the European settlers and survive." This system of abuse continued into the 19th century when the residential school system in Canada sought to abolish Aboriginal traditions, as reported by CBC News. Students were forbidden from speaking their languages and practicing their cultures, instead being abused and assimilated into mainstream society, until the last school closed only 30 years ago. These schools had and continue to have detrimental effects on Aboriginal languages and cultures. The University of British Columbia's Indigenous Foundation stated, "Many descendants of residential school survivors share the same burdens as their ancestors, even if they did not attend the schools themselves. These include the loss in Aboriginal communities of language, culture, and the transfer of knowledge across generations." But the Canadian education system has played a role as well, as it has been failing to adequately provide for Aboriginal students. In Quebec, the new high school history curriculum fails to adequately educate its students on the rich history of Aboriginals in Canada. Benjamin Shingler, a reporter for CBC News, stated, "A draft of the piloted curriculum from last September contains only a single reference to Canada's residential school system, saying they helped accelerate the decline of Indigenous languages. Given that residential schools played such a great role in the loss of Aboriginal cultures, it is concerning that they fail to deeply engage in the subject." Furthermore, Robert Laboucaine, the Director of Aboriginal Awareness in Canada, stated that the Canadian government is failing to adequately fund the education of Aboriginal students. On average, the education program on Native reserves provided more than 120,000 students with a budget that was approximately $2,000 less per student than provincial student funding. But investing in their education is investing in Canada. The Canadian Centre for the Study of Living Standards estimates that $71.1 billion will be added to the Canadian economy if Aboriginal students are provided with the same opportunities. And furthermore, it would also reduce the socioeconomic gap found with Aboriginals. Evidently, the preservation of Aboriginal languages in Canada is key to preserving their unique cultures. However, the gap in education, as well as the influence of Canadian government, is causing a serious decline in the number of speakers of Aboriginal languages in Canada. In order to prevent further loss, serious measures must be taken. Primarily, it is suggested that the Canadian government equally fund the education of Aboriginal students in Canada, as the reductions in the socioeconomic gap, as well as the potential contributions to Canadian society, far outweigh the cost. Secondly, implementing mandatory language education in Canada would help preserve the languages. As reported by CBC News, the province of Manitoba has recognized the significance and taken actions to address this issue. They are promoting language preservation and implementing mandatory language education. If other provinces were to follow suit, this would create a big change in the education system. However, it could be a vital part of preserving the unique cultures and languages at risk of vanishing. But these steps will not protect the languages that are almost vanished already. In this case, it is vital that the Canadian government strongly advocate for these languages, and Canadians take it upon themselves to respect and advocate for the unique languages and cultures. Should Canadian society do so, the languages could be revitalized, and as such, the intricate web that makes up Canada's identity could once again be whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. I have a question. It's an interesting topic that you chose. What information do you need, or did you need, that you weren't able to find or locate?
Well, this topic nowadays is huge in Canadian media because it's a really prevalent issue today. So there is a lot of information available. However, what I really wanted to get into was how the lack of education of Aboriginal students is contributing to many of the things we see today, such as the increased number of suicides and addiction rates in Aboriginal communities. And there wasn't a lot of information from reliable, credible sources on this information, but I really think that it would be interesting to look at this, and I think it would further help promote my proposals and reinforce the idea that educating Aboriginals is a necessary step.
Going along that same lines, when you were doing your research and you were reading about other people's kind of conclusions and recommendations, and maybe even the questions they wanted to ask, how did that advance your personal research?
Yes, so it was really interesting to hear the different perspectives. Specifically, the ones that helped really advance my research were first-hand sources from Aboriginals who are experiencing the effects of language loss within their communities. So reading these sources, for example, the document Towards a New Beginning, produced by the Federal Task Force on Aboriginal Languages and Cultures, it played an important role in my research because, in a way, it helped me realize what the real issues are. Because although there's a lot of research that say this is something that is contributing to language loss, it's very different to hear it from people who are experiencing the loss firsthand. So when I was able to read these sources, I was really able to pinpoint what exactly the problems were, and also I got to hear voices of how they want those problems to be solved.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.